Is caffeine good for you? And you may be surprised to hear the answer to that question. So what I want to go more in detail on is, does caffeine help studying? Because it's in a lot of stuff. It's in teas, Now, the last detail I want to get into that you may find somewhat interesting is particularly the effect of caffeine on mental health. Study that they lay out, it was interesting that they found that depressive symptoms, anxiety, that sort of Hey, my name is James Charpentier, and welcome to Less Than 3%. We talk about healthcare, my journey becoming a physician, and really anything from the perspective of a black man pursuing medicine. And in this episode, I want to talk about a topic that is definitely relevant to a lot of students, med students, I'm sure law students, dental, anywhere else alike. I think it relates to really probably anyone or a lot of people. What I want to talk about in this episode is caffeine good for you? I think that's definitely something that applies to so many people, and you may be surprised to hear the answer to that question, or at least what I have here today. So definitely make sure to stick around, listen to the whole episode. But before we get started, just want to make sure you guys know, if you enjoy this, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Hit notifications, send it to someone that you think might enjoy it. If you're listening on streaming platforms, Spotify, anywhere else, give it a follow, share it around. And I definitely hope you enjoy this episode. So the first thing I want to talk about as we're getting into this topic is just to set this episode up. First of all, what is caffeine? I want to just start off with a plain understanding of just what caffeine is. So the first thing I want to take a look at is an article that's available on the NIH National Library of Medicine, and it's from Caffeine for the Sustainment of Mental Task Performance, Formulations for Military Operations. So they go very specifically into the pharmacology of caffeine, but I'm definitely going to keep it very simple. So it's a popular central nervous system stimulant. It has a number of effects on areas like the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, renal system, and different smooth muscle effects, and of course effects on certain things like mood, memory, alertness, physical, cognitive performance. So a lot of people use caffeine in some way, shape, and form for some of these different effects that it has. Now, to talk very briefly about the mechanism of caffeine, it blocks the effect of a neurotransmitter known as adenosine, and that binds to receptors in the brain. It leads to an increase in neurotransmitters like adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. It kicks up the metabolism, you get faster breathing, heart rate, energy, focus. And so a lot of people use caffeine as a stimulant for whether it's late night studying or staying up on a late shift or different things like that, to be able to perhaps give themselves more energy, stay more focused, be alert, that sort of thing. And so, of course, a lot of students use caffeine. I'll go ahead and say for myself really quick, I'm not a coffee drinker. These days I don't really drink a lot of tea, but obviously I do definitely understand why so many people use some of these substances, and I'd say I'm relatively open to, especially when the hours probably get tougher with more clinical responsibilities. Maybe I might end up drinking a little bit of coffee or tea or something like that, but God willing, I can stay away from those. So what I want to go more in detail on is, does caffeine help studying? For that, I want to take a look at an article titled Stimulant Usage by Medical Students for Cognitive Enhancement, a Systematic Review. And so this goes into a little bit more detail about just taking a look at what the state of research is when it comes to caffeine being used specifically by medical students, but I'm sure the applications go much further than just that. So some students use caffeine, as I'd mentioned, to endure long study sessions. And there were some studies that they mentioned that seemed to cast some doubt on caffeine helping students out in terms of improvement. So just get a little bit more of a summary of some of the stuff they mentioned here. Studies show that caffeine's desired effects of increased attention and alertness are achieved at lower doses, so particularly mentions less than 4 grams, and some of its negative effects are seen at higher levels of consumption. So just to go over some of the positive effects: increased concentration, wakefulness, and faster reaction times, which are, of course, things that people want if they're especially working, I'm sure, like late hours, very tired, fatigued, not really feeling as focused. Now, in terms of long-term effects, Long-term effects of moderate regular doses of caffeine may even reduce the risk of dementia and cognitive decline. So they kind of slide that in there, which I thought was somewhat interesting from what I remember. And these effects are often sought for by individuals in physically and mentally demanding careers, like medicine, for example, and I'm sure plenty of others. Now, one of the other details that I picked up from this article that seemed pretty interesting is that dose has an impact. So caffeine's less desired effects are noticeable with higher doses, so such as more than 5 grams at least. That includes tremors, anxiety, palpitations, and among other different effects as well. Then they're also going to mention that the average caffeine consumer, they're not necessarily aware of dangerous side effects that can come from high doses, and they can unknowingly consume toxic doses because it's in a lot of stuff. It's in teas, it's in coffee. I think I remember even hearing something about, I believe it was a particular drink, like a lemonade drink, that had, I believe, really high doses of caffeine in it, and I think that might have led to a lawsuit. So of course, it's in a lot of different stuff. Now, the last detail I want to get into that you may find somewhat interesting is particularly the effect of caffeine on mental health. So I talked a little bit about having more acute wakefulness or alertness and that sort of thing, but also what goes on in terms of people's mental health altogether. And for that, I wanted to point our attention to an article titled Caffeine Intake and Mental Health in College Students. So in this paper, they talk about a survey that was done in Florida State, and what they sought to look at was a link between caffeine intake and anxiety and depression. Now, the main source of caffeine in the study was coffee, and what they found was 29.8% of students drank for studying outside of class. Now, looking at upper levels of education, so that's super senior or fifth year students, depressive symptoms, so stuff like poor appetite, overeating, sleep disorders, depressed mood, and anxiety were statistically associated with greater caffeine intake. So I thought that was an interesting thing that they pointed out, that particular study. Now, reported enjoyment and optimized studying were considered like primary motivations for consuming that caffeine. Some of the other things I mentioned as well, based off of other studies, older participants seem to have an opposite sort of effect with depression. And so one thing they mentioned is that perhaps age of consumption could have an effect. And now I definitely think, at least just off of that one particular study that they lay out, it was interesting that they found that depressive symptoms, anxiety, that sort of thing was associated with greater caffeine intake. And I think one of the things I remember thinking about looking at that article was why that particularly could have been. And what they also mentioned was some possible reasons for that were that either people were prone to depression and then self-medicated with more caffeine intake to try to improve their energy, their concentration, and deal with those depressive symptoms. Caffeine properties were interacting in the brain, leading to depressive symptoms. So it's maybe sort of a chicken or the egg type of situation. And so I think one thing important to consider is just off of that study probably wouldn't tell you caffeine is leading to depressive symptoms in younger students. It may really just be that those that are more prone to depression are taking more caffeine in order to compensate. So I thought that was an interesting thing to also keep in mind. And so that may actually be something I want to take a little bit more of a look at as well. With all that being said, kind of some takeaways from all of that. I know I mentioned a lot, referenced a few sources. Definitely go check them out. I usually always try to keep references in the description. I think there's a lot to be said and a lot to be thought about with caffeine. I think a lot of us that consume caffeine regularly kind of have a good, solid, just basic understanding of what caffeine does, how it works, perhaps being mindful of not taking too much or trying not to be too dependent. And I know I've often probably had my fair share of conversations about like a fear of becoming, dependent on caffeine or feeling like I have to always have it. And so that's probably one of the things that scared me a little bit away from drinking coffee in med school up to this point. In terms of caffeine's impact on studying, I'm sure a lot of people could say, given their experience using caffeine when it comes to different academic responsibilities, it probably does help quite a bit in terms of having that alertness and that focus. But I think, of course, it's definitely going to be important to keep in mind what negative effects could come in the long term. So really just be mindful of the intake of those things. And so hopefully this at least sparked some interest in some people listening to maybe go and do a little bit more research and see what they think about caffeine consumption in really the long run and long term. I hope this at least made a lot of you guys very aware about kind of how you manage your health and your physical and your mental as you're going about your responsibilities as a student. And I always want to really reiterate that it's definitely important to be able to take care of your body, be responsible for your entire health as you're going through whatever sort of academic journey and challenges that you may have in front of you, because you always want to make sure that you're really putting yourself in the best position to be successful both now and, of course, further in whatever sort of training or whatever pathway that you might be taking. And with all that being said, that really wraps up this entire episode. Definitely go ahead, put in the comments if you feel like there was something that you learned from this or something as a part of this conversation that you feel like you found interesting or you would want to let some people know. Definitely make sure to put it in the comments. Again, subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, hit like as well. If you're listening on streaming platforms, share it with someone you think would enjoy this episode and maybe they want to learn a little bit more about coffee. If there's anyone, if you yourself or a friend of yours is a really big fan of coffee and caffeine consumption, make sure to send this to them. They might learn some things that maybe they didn't know before. With all that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode and I'll see you in the next one.